Monday. We hope that you are happy and healthy, and we welcome you to the Religious Studies Project. My name is Brianne Fallon, and I'm with
David McConaughey, straight from Massachusetts, and still under isolation here due to COVID-19, getting up all in our business and making all of our lives move online, teleworking, remote working, potentially losing jobs. We feel that everybody is just having a rough time right now. And so we're happy to bring you a little bit of relief about that today, right, Bree?
Yeah, we're hoping that this podcast will break the monotony of whatever isolation you are in right now. And we're very excited about this episode. What do we have today, Dave?
Today we have an episode about Aniconism and challenging the way in which the normative stance of Aniconism is presented in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam with Brigitte Meyer and Terry Stordalen by Candace Mixon. So take it away.
All right, everyone. Well, I am Candace Mixon, and I am here with Terry Stordalen and Brigitte Meyer. Good morning from me, and good afternoon to you all.
Hello.
Hello, Candace.
Yes, and welcome. I'm so excited to be talking with these fine scholars on the topic of Aniconism, and we'll learn all about sort of what that is and kind of theories behind it and how it matters for the study of religion. I will just note that my interest in this as an interviewer is also invested in my own academic interest. I'm a Islamic studies scholar who works on contemporary visual and material culture related to Shia Islam, and especially regarding Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and how she's conceptualized visually and materially in Iran. So I've traveled there and sort of seen images of her and the family of the Prophet kind of all together in the fabric of contemporary Iranian society. And then some of those images are lessening a bit now, and that's due to all kinds of different pressures and reasons. But certainly the visual culture is there, the images are there, the spirit of all of that is there. So I'm so excited to talk with you all about your research in this field.
Well, I'm excited too on this.
All right, wonderful. So part of the rationale for getting you all together is that you did co-edit a book together called Figurations and Sensations of the Unseen in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I was wondering if each of you could just mention a bit about your own research and maybe what connected you with wanting to publish and collect the articles in Figurations and Sensations of the Unseen in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Okay, you want to go first, Birgit?
Okay, I can do that. Okay, I'm Birgit Meyer. I have been trained as an anthropologist and scholar in religious studies, and I have been conducting research on Christianity in Africa for a long time. And in this research, I also have focused on mission societies from Germany, active on the West African coast, who, of course, in trying to convert local populations, in a way produce ideas about idolatry, fetish worship, and all this. So indigenous worship was recast as being idolatric and strongly materially focused, whereas then missionary Protestantism was profiled as a religiosity that was devoted to the interior, devoted to book reading and all that. And I have long wondered how to come to terms with this clash about indigenous objects and the denigration of indigenous religious traditions as idolatry. I noticed with my move into religious studies that there is some kind of dearth with regard to taking seriously the material dimension of religion, which with Talal Assad, I would attribute to a post-Enlightenment Protestant bias. And I have been struggling not only empirically, but also conceptually to create more room for material objects and other material media in the study of religion. And it was in this context that I met Terje at a conference, in fact, on media and mediation at Oslo University. And there we noticed that although he comes from a different background, he will soon talk about that, we had a number of shared concerns. And so this ultimately led us to delve in this project together. But maybe Terje, you can first say more about your background.
Yes. Well, I'm Terje Stordalen, and I should start with saying I'm very happy to be part of this podcast. I was trained as a classical scholar of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament literature, and ancient Near Eastern religion. So there's a lot of language issues and literature issues, of course. But for a decade or so, I have been headed out of the, you could say, disciplinary silo that we live in down there in Hebrew Bible studies, and looking more at the wider landscape around. And I've headed a few international cross-disciplinary enterprises. One of them was Religion in Pluralist Societies, which was the host for the conference that Birgit mentioned before. And I've been really, it's been an eye-opener for me to come to religious studies, to come to anthropology in particular, and see it's possible to reflect outside of the scholarly tradition and see new aspects. And I think that's what we're doing in this volume. We have a lot of different disciplinary traditions meet and converse. And what emerges is somewhat surprising for all of us, I think, somewhat surprising view of the topic that we had at hand. Of course, down in the disciplinary silo, Aniconism is a given. That is just something that everybody thinks is a fact in old ancient Hebrew Bible religion. But it turns out it's much more complicated than that.
Well, and we can think about how pervasive it is. I don't know what kinds of courses you all teach, but I'm in a religious studies program or a religious studies department, and I often, teach introduction to Islam, or, just something very, introductory and wide ranging related to Islamic studies. And almost always the first thing that my students say if I start talking about Muhammad or images or something like that, they just say, well, that's not allowed, right? And I don't know if that's been your experience also in the classroom and not just your research. I wonder.
Oh, very much in the classroom, and not just the classroom. Outside the classroom, this perception is very pervasive as well. Everyone talking about ancient Judaism or Islam
Mm-hmm.
thinks that this is the case. Evidently, it's not. It's not that simple.
Yes, and likewise, speaking from Calvinist Holland, I'm teaching
Uh-huh.
in Utrecht, and in the Utrecht Dome, we have also one of the very, very strong, much reproduced evidences of the iconoclasm of Calvinism that was unleashed in the late 16th century, a totally smashed altar image. And so often this is taken as proof that truly, from a Calvinist perspective, there is no right for Christians to use images. But of course, all these standpoints are far too simplistic. And of course, one concern of our volume is to show very simply that empirically this is not the case, and that though we do notice, of course, some reservations with regard to images and visual representation in the three Abrahamic traditions, at the same time, we encounter a lot of image making practices and images that may give rise to all kinds of debates. But nonetheless, there is a whole stock of visual materials that is there. Concerning Islam, in our volume, we also feature an article by Christiane Gruber, who also has been writing extensively about the circulation of images of Mohammed across the Islamic world. You may be familiar with her work.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely sort of work with and sort of been in conversation and with her about some of these images. So yeah, it was great to see that representation in the volume. But yeah, just sort of going back to these issues. So we've started to dance around the idea of, some Protestant biases and some sort of shaking up the image question across these three traditions. But I wondered if one or both of you could talk to us a little bit more about what you've seen or how you've pitched it in the volume, which is as a normative belief, because that's something that we always in religious studies we want to interrogate. What are these normative or quote unquote orthodox beliefs that seem to take precedent, and maybe just conceptualize that idea for me that Aniconism has become a normative practice in both the academy and maybe in your specific subfields. Anything more you could say on that?
Well, aniconism is a very ambiguous concept to start with. So, in my disciplinary fields, it's used to denote two very different kind of practices. And one is what is called a de facto aniconism, which you then name the non-use of figural or symbolic objects in cult, simply the non-use of the absence of them. And the other is the militant aniconism, which is associated with iconoclasm and the destroying of cultic objects, almost all kinds of cultic objects, but certainly objects that are thought to represent a deity. And already this is a distinction that is lost on many people. They always think of aniconism as the latter, which in the historical record evidently is not the case. But then you have some normative concepts on top of that. And usually in Christian and I think Islamic tradition, very often this goes to the idea that figurative media are inferior to words. So there is more value for representing the other side, or the unseen, as we call it in the volume, by words. And that seems to be a perception that caught on with scholars as well. I mean, it resonates with the modernist philosophy, which for instance, Yvonne Sherwood documents very well in our book. But it doesn't really make sense when you go back and look at the material. I think my greatest surprise was that when having done the research, I realized that aniconism is just another aesthetic regime. You're still using material media and certain constellations to convey specific things. And it's not all that different from a more iconic-oriented cult.
And that's, of course, interesting. So even if you can notice certain uniconic strands in Christian and Judaic and Islamic traditions, this would not imply to uplift this aniconism into a more general scholarly stance. And what motivated us very much to do this book is to, on the one hand, document, in fact, attitudes towards images, visual regimes at different times and places in these religious traditions. But we also wanted to, in a way, challenge the study of religion to move beyond a kind of presumed normative idea that is tied to these religious traditions, that somehow images would matter less. And you can find even a kind of normative resuscitation of the second commandment in works, critical works by Bruno Latour and W.T. Mitchell, scholars whose work I value very strongly, but which I also find somewhat limited, perhaps due to some distance from theology or knowledge about the Old Testament. So in my own article in the first part, I also address Latour's famous introduction to the Iconoclash volume, in which he writes about the second commandment and its interpretation, and the second commandment in his view stating that humans are not allowed to make any representations. And obviously, this is not at all how this commandment would have been understood across time by most of the people who are trying to obey it. So the irony is that even in secular theory formation that deals in interesting ways with images, we find remnants of normative ideas about the interdiction to use images. And we decided in this volume to work through these things and work towards an approach to visual regimes in which images function by, for example, getting some more inspiration from art history, which is really, I think, a very fertile kind of cross-disciplinary encounter that stimulated a lot of the scholars in this book.
Very
Yeah,
much so.
these are wonderful points, and something that I think Terry mentioned, that these inclinations to either distrust the image or put it on a lower pedestal are also represented, of course, in the academy as well. So how we produce knowledge, and as Birgit, you also mentioned, sort of secular theory, that all of these systems reproduce the idea of logo as being the primary method through which we prove that we have knowledge. So dissertations are written in text, and visual means or video or other sorts of things might be an accessory or an appendix or some sort of additional thing. But even within the academy, the way that we have our knowledge structured is also centered on the written language as the primary and authoritative means. And that's something that I often work through with my students, considering when we talk about early Islamic history and we think about, of course, oral traditions and the spoken word. And I know that you have some chapters related to the sound and Islam, for example. But thinking about the sort of prevalence that our students and our publics see in the trust that they give the written word over any other means of representation, I think is really striking, and kind of just shows how pervasive this normative idea of Aniconism in various ways has become.
I think you're right. I think you're very right. And I think actually it relates to our understanding of concepts, because we tend to identify words as concept. We oversee the fact that words are media too. So there is an underlying sense in our culture that if you can just grasp the concept, you have grasped reality. Whereas like material media have more distance and they're more fixed, so they're not so flexible and so forth. So there is a very fundamental philosophical perception underlying all of this, and that needs to be challenged properly, I think.
Yeah, and I think that for me, so in a way to point out that the way in which we have configured research on religion in privileging textual and word-centric approaches and figuring out how these approaches are tied, in fact, to perhaps quite hidden normative claims that are grounded in the religious traditions we are then studying. In pointing that out, it is important to see that we need to move beyond this lingering aniconism and develop alternative concepts, but also methods. I'm very much interested in developing new ways of studying religion. I have been working for quite some time from a mediation approach, and I would say that in a way religions develop different kinds of media, so texts as well as images, as well as buildings, as well as even food. And as scholars, we need to be able to analyze these kinds of media, also, of course, by engaging with scholars who have a lot of knowledge about them. And in this volume, our attempt was very much to unpack, in a way, visual media and processes of figuration and imagination in conversation with scholars in art history, and in particular with a particular German strand in art history, which is called Bildwissenschaft, as developed by scholars as Hans Belting, Christiane Kruse, who also has an article in our volume, Gottfried Böhm, and others.
And you might add to all that also an interest which is brought on by you, Birgit, a focus on the sensation, the use of the human sensorium here. And in order to get a grasp of what religion does to people, or what people do with religion, you need to see all these senses playing together, and all the different media form a sort of totality. And that's what, we should see as scholars of religion when we approach these phenomena. not just the concepts that some religious elites or scholarly elites would condense from all that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is how we try to broaden here towards figurations and sensations of the unseen. And it is these two strands. So the figuration of the unseen, the mediation of the unseen, which is, of course, projected through these figurations and becomes tangible through them, and the ways in which this process of making tangible and unseen also calls on particular kinds of sensations. And we argue that different religious traditions may well be compared and distinguished by looking at the ways in which they offer figurations of an unseen and represent and mediate it, and the different sensorial profiles that are engaged in doing so. And I think this is a kind of program that joins the different chapters in this volume.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I was thinking both about, your sort of insistence on media as mediation. And I know that's a very obvious sort of connection for the word to make, but I think saying it like that, so saying media as mediation, I think really helps us draw that point home that it is some sort of communication, and whether that image is between trying to figure out how to represent God, a God, some sort of deity, or some other expression of a religious practice, feeling, etc., that media is the communicative work there. So I just really like that sort of repeating that and thinking through that word. So with that, I wondered, Terry, I know in your chapter you mention the challenges of a logocentric ideology and the distrust of a medium to be able to represent or perhaps mediate a deity. So I wondered if, in your specific example, if you could tell us a little bit more about the idea of distrusting a media to be able to work enough to represent a deity or some other religious idea.
Okay, I can do that. I will need to get a little specific then, and chart some of the presumptions that I work on.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it would just be nice to have a little bit more of maybe a detailed case study that we can sort of think through as we get these more, generic and broader sweeps that we've made or that you all have made in the volume. So that'd be wonderful.
Okay. Well, it's an accepted view among scholars that there are different strata, different strands of biblical Hebrew literature, and they're not all equally, strange to figurative representations of the deity. So I decided I'll take the most restrictive strand, the Deuteronomistic strand, as we call it, and they're the ones that give these bans on images that have become so normative in scholarship. Now, they have edited a long line of literature, which we call the Deuteronomistic history. And in this work, you have earlier sources. So you can, in that work, see how they interacted with less iconoclastically minded ideologies. I thought that might be a good case study. So I took um, a narrative on the building of the Temple of Solomon. I'm not saying that temple ever existed, but it's very easy to imagine that temple from the account given in the biblical record. In fact, it has been imagined time and over and still is around the world. So you would expect, if these people really were as aniconic as we think they should be, they would make sure to present for us an image of a temple where, imagery and symbolizations played no role at all, almost like a Calvinistic chapel or something like that. But the fact is, their account in First Kings, the book of First Kings, chapter 6 to 8, is full of figurations. There are palms, there are lions, there are cherubs, there are pomegranates, and moreover, there is an very clear architectural symbolism. So you have one stage, and then they go on to the second stage, and they go on to the third stage. So, I mean, it's full of non-verbal media. The presence of the deity in this imagined temple is not verbal at all, because when you get to the inner sanctuary, it is a complete silence, right? There is no image. There also is no word. So I came to see this as a sort of expression of a conviction that you simply cannot grasp this deity, and words do not grasp that deity either. And I thought this was a very, to me, a very instructional view into something that I thought I already knew all about.
Interesting.
But the interesting thing, Terje, is that you do not take this as proof of aniconism, but that you develop this case to show the importance of all kinds of figural representations in evoking a sense of an unseen that is withdrawn. And I found that very interesting. And that is, of course, a theme that we find in other articles in the book as well. For example, in Heike Behrens' piece on aesthetics of withdrawal, which I find very interesting. So she also makes a point that she works on the Swahili coast, where, of course, there are certain restrictions among Muslims with regard to the use of images, but at the same time, images themselves are being used in order to conceal certain things. So the image itself may be employed as a medium for concealment. And I think these are the more fine-tuned aspects, in a way, of working with images that we try to focus on in our book. We really want to get away from this all too simplistic question of yes or no images are allowed. So as to look at the working with images. And I very much, I learned a lot from Terje's piece in particular, because Terje, you show the importance of the iconic in producing a sense of something that withdraws, that is withdrawn from view, right?
Yes, I think through my piece, but even more through Heike Behrens' piece, we arrived at the view of Aniconism as a regime, as an aesthetic regime, and it makes use of all the media and all the opportunities that you have in other regimes, but it just has a particular profile. So that means that we should go back and look at all these different solutions and different traditions and see them more or less on a pair and describe how they actually employ the media and the sensation in different ways. And that is the point.
Thank you so much for that detailed look at your case study there, and sort of rethinking, something that sounds familiar. And that's always the task, is, how can I interrogate again something that I'm taking for granted? And again, that's the whole point of rethinking the normativity of Aniconism. So thank you for sharing that. Another point that I made sort of was, I was reviewing some of these things and thinking through this, is you were mentioning the shared habitus of means of seeing or sound, or sort of the shared communities that make certain regimes of sensation possible in religious traditions. Yeah. So I wonder if you can mention anything or offer any examples of the shared habitus of seeing sensation in any of the religious traditions you're working with, especially related to media or images.
Well, I think what was very interesting to look even across the Christian tradition, on which I'm working quite a lot. We have a very interesting piece by Sonja Luhrmann, a splendid anthropologist who unfortunately passed away last August, and she is an expert just before, just after our book had come out, and she's an expert on Orthodox Christianity, and has offered a fantastic piece about the importance of the icon in these Eastern Orthodox traditions. And what I found so fascinating here is that the icon is important in a way so as to prevent the human mind, the individual mind, in going astray and depicting God in all kinds of ways. It is especially the two-dimensional icon that is in a way to control, to check the human imagination and frame it in a particular way. So the icon, in this sense, is definitely part of an aesthetic regime that teaches people to imagine the unseen in a particular synchronized manner, which evolves around the figure of the icon. And I thought that this is a really very, very interesting example here.
We didn't write this, but I've been thinking of it afterwards. Maybe Birgit want to comment on this. But my impression is that these regimes are all designed in order to intensify certain chosen, experiences and even bodily experiences. So you have, for instance, the one that Øyvind Nordenvald describes in ancient Rome, using the Baroque technique of contemplation and, looking at the very, very Baroque figures that are there. It's all about, approaching a center and then releasing the tension at the center. And that seems to me to be the point, whether you use images or you use them in restrictive sense or you don't use them at all. It's all about hastening the experience when you get to what is perceived to be the central point.
Yes, and I think that is something that I tried even to thematize in preceding work when I developed the notion of a sensational form. The sensational forms that are developed within religious traditions to do exactly the job as you have just described it, Terje. And I would say that indeed visual regimes operate in the context of particular sensational forms that develop, make tangible the transcendent in certain ways, and also organize the access to it in particular ways. And I think that one can very well make comparison between religious traditions by focusing on the different sensational forms and the sensorial regimes within which they function. So for me, our volume was also one way of playing out in a way, or focusing on a particular sensational form that evolves around visuality.
Yes.
Awesome. So with that, I was just thinking about learning to see or learning to experience religion in certain ways through the different traditions. So that, I work on contemporary Shia Islam, and I know that there's some pieces in this volume that relate somewhat to that work. But basically thinking about the idea that certain Shia Muslims would have the ability to see particular images and respond and know that that's who they are or who they're representing, based on just the common knowledge and the sort of reinforcing of particular regimes and aesthetic regimes that make those intelligible, that make an image of Hussein holding the slain Commander General Qasem Soleimani in his arms as an understandable image that can convey something specific to that audience, where it might not make as much sense to someone who's outside of that audience. And I think that shared language of images and of media, especially within religious traditions, is so amazing to think through.
Yeah, and we have a piece by Pedram Khosroni, who deals with that, and Gruber's piece also deals with this kind of tradition in part. Perhaps it's also important to emphasize that in moving in a way beyond the idea of a Bilderverbot, an interdiction of images, we really focus on the use of images in very different contexts. So it is not necessarily the case, as is of course behind the fear of the image being mistaken for the divine, that all uses of images are intended as representations, as figural representations of God. Usually, if one looks more closely, one sees that there are constant deliberations about the potential of images to allude to the unseen. Actually, the whole charge even of idolatry, of the mistaking of an image for the deity, is usually a figment of accusation and by no means shared by those making use of these kinds of images. So once one looks more closely, one is able to access much more sophisticated uses of images and image theologies that move far out of this simplistic charge of idolatry as we find it from conversations and clashes in the Christian tradition, or also within the Islamic tradition, and vis-a-vis, for example, indigenous traditions in an African context. We barely came across, or I think we never came across anything like idolatry pure sang, even if there was a profuse use of images made.
I think your point, Candace, is very interesting from another perspective as well. So these regimes tend to develop certain semiotics. I mean, so sign systems that will convey certain views and certain values to the spectators. And you need to learn the semiotic system in order to understand what is going on. Now, this is, of course, the same also in European painting and in European Christianity at large. And that brings us to a point which is also important in this book: religious imagery and heritage, cultural heritage, because it becomes part of a shared cultural property, and people may use it and reuse it in different ways. And there is one piece in our book studying the opera Salome and just documenting how many of these original semiotic signs are still there, but in very subversive ways. So that also helps us understand what's going on with religion and the religious heritage today. And Birgit, this is something that you're very into for the time being. So maybe you want to comment.
Well, I'm interested in a way, the decline perhaps of Christianity as a living tradition across Europe. But in all this, we should not overlook the fact that Christian images, all kinds of tropes, of course, survive in secular forms. And we believe that with this volume that builds in a way on practices of figuration and sensation within living religious traditions, we are also able to identify the afterlives of these images in secular context. So we have indeed Ulrike Brunotte's piece on Salome. We have Christiane Kruse, who works around Michel Houellebecq's Soumission. We have Else Marie Bugdahl, who also works on modern abstract art and all that. So that is, in fact, the last part of this volume where these afterlives of Christian visual regimes are being addressed.
Great. So thank you so much for that too. And again, the details and thinking through the cultural heritage and sort of, these images being part and parcel to how also outsiders see and visualize these religious traditions. I mean, there's a reason when people go to, Florence or different museums in Italy, they absorb and take in all these beautiful Christian art forms without necessarily understanding the context that sort of brought those particular art forms to light that would have made a lot of sense for the communities in which they were born into. So on the one hand, we can appreciate the art and the beauty of them, but for people within that community, they take on a different meaning.
Exactly. And Christiane Kruse, for example, in an earlier work, Wozu Menschen malen, unfortunately only published in German, she offered a really interesting analysis in a way of the ways in which theology and art move together, but also to some degree, of course, expand and extend into each other. So she discusses indeed all kinds of restrictions with regard to the depiction of the divine, with deliberations by artists who say, well, the condition for the evocation of the unseen, of the divine, is its mediation via the image. So you see already in medieval times and in the Baroque all kinds of attempts of mobilizing images in order to make an invisible visible in the framework of the image, and at the same time seeking to circumvent charges of idolatry, which would claim that this would amount to representing the divine as such. So there is a lot of deliberation about the work of mediation that images as media can do in alluding to a kind of unseen without ever fully rendering it present as such. And I hope that perhaps reading our volume may also alert people that when they watch these masterpieces of art, they can also embed it in broader debates within the Christian realm in this case.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So I wonder if, as we kind of, we've gotten a little bit more specific, and then I wonder if we can, sort of get closer to wrapping up by thinking again more broadly. So back to the points that I brought up at the beginning of the interview, back to this issue, and I think Terry mentioned it a few times, but aniconism as just absence, and then anti-iconism or iconoclasm as no and destruction of images. So I wonder if we can sort of just think through again that tension or that conflation, and then sort of final approaches to what we can learn for going forward in the field of religious studies, how you hope that people will take this scholarship and either apply it or rethink their own research materials. So perhaps just suggestions or, again, kind of detail about this aniconism conflation with anti-iconism, wherever you'd like to go from there.
If I may have a first shot,
Sure, please.
I think there isn't all, from my perspective, there isn't all that much difference between the one and the other. The difference is more in politics than in the use of images. But obviously, setting about to destroy someone else's material basis for religion is a very powerful political move. And setting out to destroy someone for, destroying one's own material basis is another political move. And it has created opportunities for religious agents around the world to use the image or non-image question for their political religious purposes. But I think when you look at the practices, it's very difficult to see substantial differences between these. That's the religious experts. They would like us to see those distinctions, and I think demounting the distinctions maybe is one of the services that we can provide with this volume.
Yeah, I think I would endorse this and say that as scholars, we have to be very much aware of the epistemic regimes that have been guiding our research, and we have to be aware to what extent they have been guided, in fact, by normative assumptions rooted in religious traditions themselves. And we suggest, in fact, with this volume to move beyond the issue of the image question per se, to move beyond the issue of aniconism or anti-iconism versus iconodule attitudes, to move, in fact, towards a broader approach that would look at practices of figuration, at visual regimes in which images may take very, very different roles. And of course, a Bilderverbot, the interdiction of images, may be one, but there may be many, many other options. And we should, as scholars, be prepared to see all these options as, on a conceptual level, definitely equal. I think that this is very important also in relation to debates about images and religion in our contemporary society. There is some kind of irony that nowadays often Muslims are told that Christians have no problems with depicting images, with depictions of the divine. Anything goes, whereas only Muslims are not able to see this. Now, this is definitely false, of course, and I hope that through our, in a way, comparative approach, or by taking, in a way, the Abrahamic traditions, and I know that the term is also comes with its own problems. But by taking these three traditions together, we can get beyond these very simplistic ideas as we encounter them now, through which post-Christian secular people distinguish themselves from Muslims who are told to also now be able to become iconoclasts. All these are very cheap and simplistic rhetorics, I think, that ask for being further unpacked. And in fact, the Figurations and Sensation volume has a sister volume, which is a volume called Ticking Offense, which I co-edited with two colleagues, Annemarie Korte and Christiane Kruse, in which we look at image wars and contestations around offensive images in the contemporary world. So it may be nice to see the two volumes together. So in addressing, in a way, image questions, conceptually, we just have to broaden our scope, I would say.
Yes.
Wonderful. And Terry, thank you so much for bringing up the politics of, sort of the utilization of when we get to have that power over the images. Obviously, the Buddhas of Bayaman are the, often the most iconic example of that, of the destruction of those Buddhas by the Taliban, and thinking about then the power of trying to provoke also. So that sort of taking offense volume you mentioned is really interesting there, of having images of Muhammad contests out there to try to provoke some sort of response that would then, I don't know, prove something, prove all kinds of offensiveness being taken. So the politicalness of when to apply aniconism, anti-iconism, or iconoclasm are all so prescient, especially right now, and thinking about how relevant images are for communicating larger political goals, not just religious ones. So thank you so much for that. Any final words you've got for us? I mean, this has been really awesome, and I've loved talking to you, and this just makes me more excited to dive in deeper to this book and also the Taking Offense book. But anything other you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
Maybe just a small footnote, perhaps. But what I try to emphasize in my chapter and also my work is, of course, the tremendous iconoclastic attacks with regard to indigenous traditions.
Right.
Have been launched by both Protestant and Catholic mission societies, leading also to the collection of lots of items from Africa and other parts of the world that are now located in mission and ethnographic museums. And of course, the point that this iconoclastic attack is in fact still going on and launched by many Pentecostal churches. I'm addressing this to some extent also in my chapter in the book, and I think this should also be remembered when talking about IS and Palmyra or the Bamiyan examples. Yes. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm just very happy about this conversation. I'm also very happy about this collaboration with Terje and the other scholars, and I hope very much that this work will trigger debates, will trigger more works. So in many ways, I must say, I'm not yet done with the images and the image question. I really hope that with this, we will be able to offer some incentives to broaden the study of religion conceptually and methodologically, to indeed research on processes of figuration and the imagination beyond rather simplistic views. And of course, there is some good work out there. Sally Promy, David Morgan, Chris Finney, just to mention people in the field of material religion, for example. But I do think that this is really a strand that, may deserve somewhat more attention in our also very heavily media saturated and image full world. So we live just in a world with so many images. Often we don't know their provenance. We are not so much aware about of the provenance of our stances with regard to images, our preparedness to believe in them or not, and all that. And I think religious studies has much to say and unpack here.
Wonderful. Anything other you'd like to note, Terry, before we?
No, I think Birgit covered most of that
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
That was a great summation. Well, thank you all again. Again, the book that they've been kind of mentioning and we've sort of been dancing through is called Figurations and Sensations of the Unseen in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it is thankfully open access, which is amazing. So people can access it sort of regardless of institutional affiliation and library access. So it's very accessible. And we do thank you for making that book so accessible. So on behalf of the Religious Studies Project, thank you all.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm really thankful in this moment when we're all online and so many things have been moved online. The classroom has been moved online and religious worship has moved online. And one of the things that really struck me about it, and Bree, you can weigh in on this and how it's working in Australia, is that so many of the people that would like to go to church can't go to church right now. They can't go to temple. They can't go to the synagogue. They can't go to the mosque. And they're having to find ways to do these things remotely, do them through technology, do them visually. And in the context of today's episode, it really raises a lot of questions about how we are using these media technologies to see what's happening in religious spaces. And it ties in with all kinds of really important ideas about which elements of ritual really require a participation, what the level of participation is when you mediate it through a technological device. And for a minute, Bree, what do you think about the impact that social distancing is really having on the way in which mediatization is presenting these kind of new visual opportunities for religion?
I think it really sort of taps into something that was sort of underlying that podcast as a whole, which is sort of challenging the idea of a normative stance on aniconism, the idea that there are either images or there are not. And looking at the way that religious worship has moved online in light of COVID-19, the way that we're live streaming, worship online, and that idea of that sort of mediation through technology, it sort of adds all of these shades of grey to the concept of icons, of authenticity, of engagement. And in this world of technology that has become so vital at the moment, we do have to sort of take a step back and just stop and think about the way that we've, categorized or labeled or understood religious experience in the past. And I think it's something that will continue to change in the coming weeks and months as COVID still is out in the world, and we might see some new innovation in the way that technology is mediating these experiences and adjusting how we interact with religious imagery. And this is, if you look at the images around the world at the moment, we're seeing religious sites that are completely empty and everybody is engaging through technology, and it's just a completely different way of thinking about the concept of the icon. Dave, what do we have coming up next week? I want to give our listeners something to look forward to amongst the isolation. What do we have coming up?
Well, I don't know that it's the best time for this episode, but it's the episode that has been planned for quite a while to talk about near-death experiences. Chris Cotter, one of the wonderful founders of the Religious Studies Project and a contributor of so many great episodes, had the opportunity to speak with Jens Schlieder about near-death experiences. And this includes things like the Wizard of Oz or flatliners, to a lot of other kind of more technical and medical research about it. And so while everyone might be thinking about mortality in some really visceral and intimate ways right now, there are a lot of things that religious studies perspectives have to offer about thinking about death and thinking about near-death narratives. And we're delighted to present one of the real experts on this topic. And we're so happy that Chris was able to speak with Jens. And we will present that for you next time. And until then, I think all that's left for us to say is Thanks for
listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.